It is my pleasure to be together with my brother Greg. We will be on first name basis, and we do have lengthy CVs that give the academic pedigree. But we want to focus on a friendly conversation. Did I say it right?
I think you did. I think I am a little concerned that we're appearing on 1960 Zenith TVs with 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 if you take into fact our white hair.
Well, I don't have white hair here because I have carefully shaved it.
That
Before
counts. That counts.
that counts as well. Yes,
Yes,
indeed.
we are twin sons of different mothers.
There we go. Hallelujah. It feels good to have a Christian background that puts us together, besides the academic backgrounds that we share also our interest in critical thinking from
Mhm.
different disciplines, which will become obvious. And the purpose of the conversation is not to provide the final answer, but to provide opportunities for dialogue. Just like we're having a dialogue, we invite others to have a dialogue along with us. And some of the biases that we carry, I already mentioned Christianity.
Mhm.
What does that mean for you, Greg?
Christianity or other biases.
Well, the Christianity as a bias that we
It
carry.
certainly that I'd have to admit to uh, growing up in a Christian home, church going. So the stories of the Bible certainly influence me. Um, I also think that I could uh, probably have kind of the same influences if I believed in the golden rule, which interestingly enough appears in almost every society, slightly different words. The golden rule is universal. But nonetheless, my Christian upbringing is going to influence my thoughts. That also means that as a questioning person, my Christian upbringing, my Christian values may well sometimes be areas of dissonance for me, where I can't make the two jive, if you will. So that I had mentioned that as part of the bias.
Thank you. And thank you for that honesty that shows that we are not a final product, are we?
Hopefully,
We
we're
are
always evolving.
we are rolling, we're still thinking, we're still unfolding what we believe and what does it mean. And that is true of
I'd
our
add
society.
another bias. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, no, no. Tell me about the other bias. That's more interesting.
The other bias is that I also grew up a white kid,
Yes.
and that truly is a bias. I grew up in nice neighborhoods. I had a professional father, um, and that is a bias too. One which I have been challenging for myself for many years, and more recently, um, as books like uh, White Fragility, things, books like that have come out, have had to challenge myself even more, which is not always comfortable. But that bias is there too.
And what do you assume I have as an equivalent bias? In your case, you have called it white bias, white
Hmm.
normativity. You did not use the word normativity, but white normativity of the
Right.
West and the West. What would you say is mine?
Well, certainly you also have the Christian background. Um, you also have the bias of a man of the cloth within that, and the bias of the educator. We both share those biases. I would also guess that you have the bias with your Hispanic uh, background, have a bias within that,
Indeed,
having having uh, having been, or even still, a minority view, and I'm not putting any attachments to that, but that would no doubt be a bias too, which we may find some interesting ground to talk back and forth with my white bias that I am fighting and building upon. Um, so I would think that might be one also.
indeed, indeed. And the truth of the matter is, I grew up seeing myself as white.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that I was a white gringo, a white US citizen.
Right.
I learned that I was Puerto Rican, though I knew all the time that I was born in Puerto Rico. I
Right.
learned I was Puerto Rican in Latin America. And in the US, I learned I was Latino.
Mm-hmm. Or
First,
Latinx.
it is yes, now it's Latinx. And when I began this path back in 1994, no, actually 1985, when we moved from Honduras to Massachusetts, he was Hispanic.
Mm-hmm.
And I learned I was Hispanic, not definitely not gringo in the eyes of the people around me. I am still in the position of privilege in whiteness in the context of Puerto Rico.
Mm-hmm.
And it is a funny thing then to be in the context of a so-called minority. And I say so-called because right now the US is in a change, like it has always been. And Hispanics or Latinx, or those that speak Spanish, are the largest so-called minority and continue to grow.
Right. Right.
And whites will become the largest minority very soon. What I mean by that is better suited to your world. You use statistics a lot more than I do. I do use statistics, but in public health, you use it even more. Statistically speaking, we both live in California. California has no majority.
Right. Right. Right.
Meaning there's no 51% of the population of any one group. So
Right.
your group, so-called whites, are the largest minority.
There you go. Now,
Yeah.
with that, we also share another,
Yes.
um, I don't know if it's a bias, but another ethnic trait. We both are Scandinavian or
Yes,
partially Scandinavian.
definitely so.
But it does show that race and ethnicity, for lack of a better word, is complicated.
Indeed. And that's a wonderful segue to our first question. Or
Fire away.
what is racism? Parenthesis. Is that a useful word? Parenthesis. Today?
Hmm.
That question could take us the whole time.
True.
So what is your first take? Let's go for the feelings first. What do you feel?
For the feelings. Okay. Um, for me, the emotional aspect, the feeling aspect, comes from my exposure and a relationship with other people, and more specific minorities. I remember kind of the first time that my worldview was kind of challenged was when I was in junior high, and we had a teacher, very creative person. Actually, I think one of the reasons I went from being a C and D student, let's pass them to get them out of the classroom, because I was hyperactive, and finally in seventh grade, I had this creative teacher. I mean, he was an artist, storyteller, that type of thing. And I think I perked up and started listening.
What grade was it?
Seventh grade.
Okay.
Seventh. And I went from C's and D's to A's in 1 quarter.
We should worship that professor.
I do. And in several ways. And one of the ways was that he was very socially minded. He had been a man of the cloth before he became a teacher. And once again, introduced another bias. I went to parochial school. And he asked a friend and I, we were playing guitars and singing at that point, if we'd like to do a story hour in the ghetto area of Denver. And we said, sure. And he'd tell stories because he was great, and he'd draw pictures while he was telling the stories. And then we'd sing a song, and then he'd do another story, that type of thing. And suddenly I saw that not everybody lived in the Cherry Hills neighborhood of Denver, upscale, and had professional parents. And I was struck by poverty and other things like that. And so that challenged my thinking back then, and the emotion of that. When I saw, I was a kid, seventh grade, you're still a kid. And I saw other kids so different than I, at least from the perceived benefits of my whiteness, of my family's professionalism, of my family's economic status. And I certainly emotionally felt bad. And fairness has, since I've been a kid, has always been a key component to my personality.
That probably has to do with the stories of the Bible.
There you go. So that's probably my first exposure to it. Then having friends that were different minorities and seeing how they were treated differently. I wrote a short essay that I posted on Facebook a few months ago. And I talked about a friend that was in the doctoral program with me there. And he was African American. And we both lived in North Berkeley, the hills of North Berkeley. And we would study till late at night, not always together, often not, and then walk home. Now, I walked home for years, the years I was at Berkeley, never once got stopped by the police, never got hassled. He'd walk home, just like me, living in a place up there. And the cops would stop him. What are you doing here? Let's see your driver's license. And he, interestingly enough, was military police in Vietnam. And so sometimes, and understandably, he was offended by that. And he would even maybe give them some lip. They'd arrest him, take him down to the station. And then they'd find out, well, he's a doctoral student in Berkeley and he's military police, and let him go. Well, that once again, with fairness was a real hit to me. Why is that? What's the difference? I mean, this guy is equally as smart as me, probably worked a lot harder to get where he got to than I did, but yet he's treated this way. So there's been instances like that through my life where I have this emotional connection to the lack of fairness that comes with a bias or racism.
Did it make you feel guilty?
Yeah. I think that certainly was one of the emotions. Do I deserve it? I mean, even with that statement I just made that he worked harder to get there. I mean, he, came from the South. His mother was a domestic. His father was a hod carrier for bricklayers. They got by through the winter by canning stuff in their garden during the summer. And he got out of the South by joining the military. And he was the first person in his family to go beyond high school. And he got an AS degree. And this is all after he got back from Vietnam. So he got a 2-year degree first, and his family was, yeah, great. We have a college graduate in our family. And then he got his 4-year degree, and it was, well, good, Then he got his master's, and they were kind of, you ever going to stop going to school? And then he got his doctorate. And that was very different than my path there. I came from a professional family of physicians and dentists, where the pressure on me to go into medicine or dentistry was so strong that when one of my uncles, I told one of my uncles that I was going to get a doctorate in public health, he said, "Oh, Greg, I have a patient who went to Berkeley and he got a doctorate in English, and he's selling shoes door to door now. Kind of like there's one path you can go. You can choose between medicine and dentistry, but those are your choices." So our paths were so different.
And that is an uncomfortable feeling, the feeling of guilt.
Yeah.
And it's not a very useful feeling.
No. And I think I am over that now. Well, I can't say that. It comes and goes. But now I think in my life, I'm more, how can we better the path of everyone so that they can have the same? I don't regret how I grew up. I don't regret the success that I've had, but I would like for all my friends to have that same success, and even those who are not my friends to have the same opportunity.
And this regurgitation of our histories and thinking about the privilege of our upbringing. I also had a privileged upbringing. It was in Puerto Rico, but it was a middle class upbringing. My mother was pursuing a master's degree while I was a child. My father never did more than his high school diploma, but still he had the high school diploma. And my mother became later a university professor after she finished her doctoral degree at the University of Chicago. And my grandfather had been to Cornell University to study engineering, though he did not graduate because he chose to elope. Elope? What is the word when you go with your girlfriend?
Oh, elope. Did
Yes.
he elope with your mother? No sanctioned marriage there, no church wedding.
My grandmother. He was but I grew up in a place where I knew I was going to do a doctoral degree. At first, I thought that it was going to be medicine, but later it changed. The point is, I am of privilege. It is always relative to the context where we are at.
True.
But still, it's a position of privilege. And that triggers self-examination and comparing ourselves with others. And the question of racism, is that a useful word? It will be useful only if it produces a useful comparison.
True.
Not for the purpose of triggering guilt, but we do have an example, an article that we are going to talk about now that comes from the Atlantic, and it was published September 25 of 2020.
Mm-hmm.
Connor Friedersdorf is the author, and the title is How Princeton Opened Itself to the Ultimate Troll. So this article provokes a question, but before we tell the question, would you mind telling succinctly, briefly, what is the article about, and mentioning Christopher L. How you pronounce his last name?
Oh, you're going to ask me?
The president of Princeton University. Ace
As
Grover?
Gruber?
Something like that.
We may have just slaughtered his last name.
Yes.
We apologize, Dr. Ice Gruber.
Naughty, 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 naughty.
We're back to that guilt, are we?
So let's call him Christopher, shall we?
I like that. And if we want
What
to get
did
more
Christopher
familiar, we'll call him Chris. No, we won't do that. We'll stick with Christopher. So you want kind of a synopsis of the article. I think I would have titled the article Catch 22.
That's a good one.
But basically what happened is a number of the faculty, a high number of faculty, I think it was like 300 faculty members, and groups of students basically challenged the administration with the idea that, even though they felt that gains had been made as far as anti-racism, and specifically in this case, anti-Black racism, that there still was systematic racism. It was there. And they challenged the school to look at it, number one. I don't know that they asked to have the school apologize for it, but I think that was complicit in it. And then the question to follow that was, what do you do after that? So the president took that on. I mean, I think to his credit, he took that on and studied it and came back and said, I agree. We could do more. We should do more. And then the administration, being the Trump administration, under the guise of the education department, Betsy DeVos, who's the Secretary of Education, they came back and said, well, according to the law, if you're practicing racism, we can punish you by, number one, coming in and doing a very intrusive study, interviewing people under oath, etc. And if we find that you're right, that you haven't done everything you could do, then we can deny your funding. You'll no longer get research funds, and universities stay alive by funding from the government. That's all in a university. It's private, public, and so that'd be a death knell to the university. And thus, our new title of the article, Catch 22. Yeah, and forgive me if this goes against the man of the cloth person I see across from me, but you're damned if you do, and you're damned if you don't. Right? And so it really put them in a difficult position. And I think would you add to that? What else do you see in the article that I didn't mention?
I believe you capture it very well. I will simply follow what you're saying, not that anything was lacking, but the follow-up. So the question is, did he do the right thing by listing these examples and by saying, yes, indeed, we had slaves from which we profited because they were working as slaves for Princeton, and we have all of these other forms and fashions of discrimination against blacks in the past, and we are guilty for that. So
Right.
that's but should he have done that? Would we have done it if you were president? Would you have done it? Would I do it? I don't know the answer to the question. I am inclined to believe that I would have done it,
Mhm.
but uh, why? What is the purpose? And let's put aside the Trump administration and Secretary DuBois' response, and instead imagine it in a world where there's no yet an answer from the government.
Right.
It serve a purpose for
Right.
the university life itself. What do you think?
You know, I think I would have. And it might be useful here, Johnny, to look at the different types of racism, because it is possible to have made progress in some areas, but not in others. I read an article which was helpful that looked at three different degrees of racism, and it was written by, giving him credit where credit's due, looking for his name on here, and I'm not finding it, but it was also from, name was John Rice. And he basically defines it this way, as first degree racism is what we all would, even racists would agree that it fits under racism. You know, it's things like, pardon?
Like a sign for whites only.
Yeah, exactly. Calling the police on a black bird watcher. You know, we had that one recently here, right? That's an example of overt first degree racism. Or calling someone the N-word to establish that the person using the N-word is in a position of power over the person that they're calling the N-word. So that would be, first degree racism. Then he goes on to talk about second degree racism, which he states is basically opposing or turning your back on anti-racism efforts. So one clear example coming out of the news again with the George Floyd death would be, I think most everybody believes that it was racist of the one officer to put his knee on the neck of George for 8 minutes and counting.
Yes.
That's first degree. But the other officers there, the 3 or 4 officers that were watching, in essence, turned their back on him. I mean, none of them pulled the first officer off the gentleman. So that would be second degree. And so, I'm not racist, but I don't really concern myself with, the topic or what needs to be done. So I'm turning my back to it.
And also in that second degree, the officers were protecting the one overly racist officer. Because
Right.
if they had not been there, the public may have intervened and push the officer or say something more aggressive. But the
Right.
3 other officers were there holding their guns, so they are protecting.
Right. Good point.
Racist.
Good point. So those are examples of that type of racism. Another you can see in sports. If you notice that the NFL commissioner has come out recently.
There was a startling admission late today from the commissioner of the National Football League, Roger Goodell says the NFL was wrong not to listen to its players' concerns about racism, and he says the league now encourages the kind of peaceful protests that many say cost former quarterback Colin Kaepernick his job. The statement, though, made no mention of Kaepernick. This all comes amidst a nationwide protest against police brutality against Black people.
My players have been telling me that this goes on, and I kind of ignored it. And, I think we should apologize for that. Now, he never apologized to Kaepernick for taking a knee to try to get this out into the public. But nonetheless, it's saying, okay, we stood on the sidelines, analogy intended, and didn't do anything about it. So that would be second degree. Then
Yes.
Third degree is probably what I would call systematic racism. And that is basically probably the most pernicious category of racism. And it's when employers and educational institutions, which we're talking about, government entities don't kind of unwind the practices that lead to and maintain this racial bias. So it's the bias in hiring, it's the bias and those type of things that maintains it. It's more unseen and unspoken to. But would you consider that systematic racism?
Yes, indeed. It is the fact that when you look at the percentage of the distribution of race in the population and compare it with the percentage of the leadership and the race distribution, you see the discrepancy. You may have 80% people of color, that is the term to cover all so-called minorities based on race, color, and though they are 80% of the population in many portions of the nation, cities and other areas, they are only 20% of the leadership over that 80% of the population, over the whole population. And
Right.
that category of racism.
And we see that in certainly in policing, we see that in justice, prisons. My wife and I just watched the movie called Just Mercy, a true story about a guy on death row who in the South, and was after a white woman had been murdered. They couldn't find who did it. And after a year, they basically framed this black man.
Ordered, adjudged, and decreed that Walter McMillan is to face death by electrocution.
This is my dad, sir.
Sit down, young man.
John, I want you to sit down now. He did nothing wrong. Please, Judge, hold on 1 second.
I won't say it again. Sit down.
Not if you gonna kill my dad for no reason. You killing my family!
An innocent man. I was always taught to fight for the people who need the help the most. You don't know what it is down here. They ain't got to have no evidence.
How many of you all were with Walter that morning?
We want you! We all want you!
Your life is still meaningful. And I'm going to do everything possible to keep them from taking it.
And it was amazing. The attorney who finally got him off, he exposed the systematic racism, if you will, with dire consequences, and exposed how basically crimes were committed in framing this guy. And the guy was free, which is great. But the sheriff who did this, and I won't go into all the different things that he did, but the sheriff who did it wasn't disciplined. As a matter of fact, he won 6 more elections before he retired. So the systematic racism continues on.
Yes. So there's tolerance and there is overlooking of the signs. We don't want to know.
Right.
There are things that we simply don't like to know. Don't talk about it.
Ignorance is bliss.
Yes. So when President Christopher chose to highlight the shortcomings of Princeton University and write this letter, again, we have chosen to ignore the Trump administration Secretary of Education response because that belongs to a category of itself.
And it's also very touchy right now, too. So.
Instead, let's focus on the institution itself. So the majority of the professors welcome it. They ask for it. So what? Now, what is the next step? What are we supposed to do once we know this? That is not stated in the letter. That is not part of what he was addressing, and that was not what the professors were asking for. What are we going to do next? Is there a disconnect between a process of naming the wrongs and responding to address the wrongs today? Because the events he was talking about, slaves, there are no slaves of the kind that he was naming in the guilt declaration. There are no slaves today. Of course, there are direct, you can draw lines, a straight line between those that were slaves and the children and the children of the children. And today you will find a direct correlation between the slavery and the lack of resources because you could not inherit past the inheritance. But what are you supposed to do? Because Princeton University enslaved and had some slaves, but the implications are bigger, are societal. So what is supposed to do? What are we supposed to do as institutions if we are acknowledging? Let's say I am the CEO of a hospital, and I want to acknowledge. It might be more touchy in a hospital setting to write a letter like this, to testify that indeed you had slaves, the institution had slaves. I don't know how many hospitals are still the same institution from the days of slavery up to today. What about, do they exist? Do you think there are some hospitals that come all the way from the time of slavery?
You know, I don't know the answer to that question. You know, I don't.
Probably not, because they are more frail institutions. Hospitals are more frail, and they are more recent in the universe of ideas today. What a hospital is, maybe from the time of Jim Crow, but not from the time of slavery.
Well, now that we talk about that, there certainly are hospital systems that are religious based and go back beyond or before the founding of our country. So those hospital systems still exist. So I'm going to change my answer. Can you do that on Jeopardy? I'm change my answer. Yes, I think there are hospital systems that predated that, and certainly you would go back and look at them, and I think in most cases we'd agree and say, well, that was racist. You know, we took advantage of indigenous people and that type of thing. So I think there are.
Yes. So let's assume that such a hospital exists, such a hospital system exists. They have done the exorcism of naming these scenes. What is next? What is supposed to happen next at the hospital, at the university, at the institution we are in control of, a church, whatever other institution? What is next?
I think it kind of comes back to those 3 degrees of racism that we talked about. I think every hospital, at least that I know of, certainly agrees that first degree of racism is bad, and they don't do that. They're not going to call a patient the N-word, and that type of thing. I think what are you going to do about it is more the second and third degree, and specifically the third degree, the systematic racism. And I can give you a good example. I won't use any names of hospital corporations, but I worked on a project where we did customer service training for a large hospital. And part of that was also diversity training. And even partway through this process, they hired a person of color as the head of the Office of Diversity Planning. Now, the interesting thing is, here's this, which I think biased here. This is a self-serving bias, but I think we did a very good training program for customer service, because hospitals should be customer service oriented too. Now, you think that that's common sense, but not really. I mean, many hospital systems, especially those coming out of religious background, it's kind of like, well, you should be thanking us that we're helping you, versus, well, you're our customer. We want to make sure you're happy and healthy. So the hospital even agreed to doing almost a week-long program. Now that is a hospital expense too, because if you have employees that are sitting in chairs discussing and learning, that can add up. But here's where the difference is. They refuse to mandate that every employee needed to participate.
Volunteer.
Right. So that's kind of like writing a letter saying, yes, we think that this is an issue. You give it with this hand, then you take away it with this hand by saying, well, not everyone has to go to that. And as you would expect, the people who most needed to come for customer service or diversity training, which I think are one and the same in many ways, they didn't come.
Yeah.
Kind of like preaching to the choir.
Yeah. And this is a very important example, because administration has to commit funds.
Yeah.
Make a commitment. And you have to have the courage that Christopher had. I have another example that comes also from the hospital setting. I was called as a consultant for diversity at a big hospital in a city that will remain nameless. And they had a case, among others, that they wanted to hear my perspective on how to address from there on. This case was nerve-wracking because a patient whose a child was brought into the hospital after the hand was crushed by an accident, and the mother does not speak English, and the hospital had a practice, listen to this, that the hospital department and name telephone directory had a column of language. For the purpose, and he had a note, for the purpose of translating. So they call a janitor, whom they had regularly used, to translate from English into Spanish. And the surgeon says to the janitor, tell the mother we will have to cut off the finger because we cannot save it. And the translator found it too harsh. So he did not translate such harsh words into the Spanish language. When the child comes out of surgery and the mother examines the hand of the child, I am laughing here, but this is no laughing matter. the mother discovers the child is missing a finger. And to her
When she
dismay,
thought they're going to trim his fingernails, right?
something like that, imagine such a tragical event.
Yeah,
And that is definitely racism
yeah,
because of the second category. Because if you know, you are admitting that you know there's a need to translate by creating that list. The
right.
second thing you are admitting is you pay no importance to this, assuming that you don't need any particular training. Anybody, a janitor can translate for a surgeon.
Right. A good example. That really is.
So you could imagine the interesting conversations that follow. We have to
Another one, very similar. We could probably do examples all day long, but once again, hospital, and the same hospital I was talking about before, and we were meeting with key people in the hospital before doing this customer service training and diversity training, and talked to some pretty high up, and no doubt representative of many, not all, but many in the administration. And we're talking about the Hispanic population and how some of the outreaches that we wanted to do so that, and by the way, least you paint too rosy of a picture. This was also an economic decision on our part because the hospital had a large Hispanic population. The hospital actually, needed to be treating Medi-Cal patients, and has something that calls disproportionate funds, meaning that if you're treating a high percentage of Medi-Cal in California, Medicaid throughout the rest of the country, and Medicare, which are all discounted as far as paying the hospital, that the government, the federal government then comes in and says, okay, we're going to give you more money because you can't just exist on that. So in order to bring more of that population in, we wanted to do that by treating them as good customers. So I used to tell my students that public health and marketing, good marketing, there's also very bad marketing, but public health and marketing are not that dissimilar. You need to understand your customer to be able to provide good care.
Yes.
To which this person responded, oh yeah, we don't want more Hispanics. They come, the whole family and extended family comes and they're clogging up the hallways and blah, 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 blah. Now, from a public health standpoint, the person missed the whole point, because we know from public health that your support system is a major part of how well you recover.
Exactly. And also compliance afterwards.
And compliance afterwards. Yeah. So another example of that.
And going to a last example, this time from the educational system, I have been involved with educational institutions of the college and university level. It will remain nameless. This institution was looking...
I think we should start a institution. We should name it Nameless.
Nameless, yes. Nameless institution in a nameless state.
Yeah, right.
Well, this nameless institution in a nameless state wanted more Hispanics because they were a growing population in the catchment area for the institution.
Right.
And they translate the instruments for marketing. And they go where the market is.
Right.
But when it came time to do economic advising, financial advising, everything was in English.
So when you were admitted and you had to sign the forms, right? That was all in English.
You're admitted, but then there's no way for you to communicate with the family and help them navigate the steps that
Right.
they are not familiarized with. Because if you are, there's a lot of knowledge that comes from inheritance. From if my parents have
Right.
been to educational institutions, they know there's a academic admission, they know there's a financial admission. But if you're the first generation, you have no support.
Right.
And if you're going to invite the students in, and you're going to market to get the students in. Once they are in, if you pretend to have them retain at the institution, you have to put the whole system together.
Right.
Otherwise, it's institutional racism because you are not doing the necessary adaptations to respond to the market that you are looking to serve.
Right.
Institutions, in other words, after acknowledging their shortcomings, they need to think of operational ways to address those shortcomings. And we have not gone into the complicated questions of reparations.
Right.
Topic.
Another good topic for another conversation.
Yes. And any parting words for President Christopher? What would you tell him, or what would you ask him if he was to be here with us? What could we learn from him, or what would we say?
That's a good question. I think, just surmising what his faculty and students were asking of him, and the reason we gave those examples that we did is, you've done part of it, part of the process, and they were recruiting, like you just said with your example, recruiting students of color and faculty of color. But I think what they were asking for was the next step, and that was to go past primary and secondary racism and look at the third category of systematic racism. Why do you only have, I can't remember what the article said, but 7% of the professors were Black. Well, why is that? And there is an old comeback to that, which you often hear, and that's mediocrity. There's just not enough students that have come up through the ranks to and got their doctorate, that type of thing. And I think, once again, with systematic racism, you have well-intended people that don't realize that it exists.
Yes.
They've been part of the system. I mean, myself being one of them, right? And didn't realize that it was easier for me than somebody else. So I think one of the comments that I would make for him is, you need to look at where systematic racism happens. Why do you have fewer Black professors? Mm-hmm. Quite frankly, if you were truly looking at the ideal, where you would have all kinds of different colors, ethnicities represented, you have to ask the question, well, why isn't that the case? And what could you do to, have that happen? Quite frankly, scarcity should be a major motivator.
Yes.
And those minority professors should have been probably paid more, sought after more, because there's fewer of them. And so that economic power, if you will, but then you have to look at, well, how do we contribute to that system? How can we unwind that? Let's assume that there was no malice there, that Princeton really was trying. I think what they were asking him, and what I'd recommend to him, is let's look at it more in depth. Let's look at the systematic stuff that we don't realize is going on there. And I think there's one of the retorts, if you will, to the article, a gentleman by the name of Kennedy, who actually was a graduate of that university. And he was using that mediocrity type of counterpoint, saying, well, we just, they've tried hard, there's just not that many out there. Well, maybe what the university needs to do is start working with programs that grows, so to speak, professors. So you start in high school, or you start wherever, mentorship programs, those type of things, where you are growing and telling that population, you could be this, we want you to be this. So I think that would be one of the things I'd recommend to them.
Definitely. And what you just described is precisely what happened in the 1950s when Princeton and other universities, and having a doctoral degree in the 1950s was the exception, not the rule among whites.
Right.
So how did you ended up having so many white academicians with doctoral degree? Because you grew them, because you groomed them, because you encouraged them, because you found them, because you identified them, because you paid for their education. And what happened in the 50s for whites needs to happen in the 20s for those that have been yet excluded. And that will be addressing level 3 racism. Reproducing the past in the present.
And taking it even a step further, what many CEOs don't realize, maybe even well-intentioned CEOs or presidents of universities, is that within the scarcity of Black employees, Black professors, whatever you might want it to be, Hispanic employees, that one of the reasons may be that your minority employees, professors, etc., are spending a third of their time worrying about, well, am I not getting the same opportunities? Am I not worthy of those opportunities? What if I'm a bad example and I fail? What have I done to my people, so to speak? And that's, I've always found in the companies that I have ran, that fear is the enemy of innovation. And so if I'm worried about my job, worried that there are more expectations of me because I'm a minority and underrepresented, that's going to block my doing the best job. That's going to block myself, maybe from putting myself forward as, hey, I could be a professor, I could be a vice president, I could do that. So I think those are the type of things that Christopher could look at and know there shouldn't be any backlash to that. And we're not talking about the backlash here, but the threat from the government to withdraw your funding because you're looking at that is very counterproductive.
Definitely. Thank you for a good conversation.
They're always good. I love talking to you.
And we will continue.
Very good. Thank you, Johnny.
Hasta la vista.
Hasta la vista, baby.
Yes.